All right. Looks like we have people joining from all over the country. Feel free to keep chiming in with where you're from, and we'll go ahead and get started with today's event. My name is Jennifer Brummett, and I'm CurePSP's Director of Scientific Affairs and Partnerships, and we're glad you could join us to learn about our ELPFDD meeting on PSP that we'll be hosting in February. So first, just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Today's webinar is scheduled to last approximately 1 hour, and we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. So if you have any questions related to today's webinar topic, please feel free to put them in the chat box throughout the webinar, and we'll address questions at the end. If you have questions that we don't have the time to get to or other questions related to another topic, you can also reach out to CurePSP after the webinar and we'll follow up with you on those topics. The webinar from today will also be recorded and available for viewing on our website after the event if you would like to go back and reference any of the material. We'd also like to acknowledge our industry sponsor for this webinar and workshop, Novartis. We're very grateful for their support of this important initiative. And by the time of our workshop in February, we will be able to acknowledge a few other industry partners as well. So we're very grateful for their support of this workshop. First, a little bit about CurePSP. I'm sure most of you are familiar with us if you found our way here, but we just wanted to make sure everyone is familiar with our organization. So we're a nonprofit, and our mission is to raise awareness, build community, improve care, and find a cure for progressive supranuclear palsy, corticobasal degeneration, and multiple system atrophy. And we do this work within 3 pillars of our mission. The first is care. We have a lot of programs that seek to improve and provide excellent clinical care for these 3 diseases. Consciousness is the second pillar. We have a growing advocacy program, and we do a lot of work to improve education and patient advocacy around these 3 diseases. And the third pillar is cure. We fund research and do our part to partner with industry partners and research to further treatments and hopefully a cure for these 3 diseases. Today's workshop falls within this last pillar as we're seeking to bring in the PSP community perspective to the drug development process to further this goal. First, I'll give a brief introduction of what an ELPFDD meeting is, and this stands for Externally Led Patient-Focused Drug Development Meeting, which is kind of a mouthful, so you'll hear it referred to as PFDD or ELPFDD throughout the meeting materials and today's webinar. And these are workshops that allow a chance for nonprofits like ours to apply to the FDA to host a meeting and give our community, so people with PSP, their care partners, and their family, to share their voices and stories with the goal of accelerating research and improving care for PSP. So today's webinar will orient you to what the drug development process looks like and what an ELPFDD meeting is, and hopefully we can convince you that it's important for you to participate and show up to the workshop, which will take place on Friday, February 6th at 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And this will be a virtual event that will be live streamed from the CurePSP website. The purpose of these meetings is to allow us at CurePSP and our community to educate the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, known as the FDA, and other key stakeholders, including researchers, regulatory partners, clinicians, drug developers, and the general community about what it's like to live with PSP, the daily impacts of symptoms on the lives of people with PSP and their loved ones and care partners. It's also intended to help share how you and your loved one are currently managing PSP with different treatments, and then also hear what a meaningful treatment might look like to you or your loved one. We hope that people with PSP and their care partners will participate because your voices are really the experts in what living with PSP means. So your voice will be incredibly important to the conversation. the FDA approves all potential treatments for PSP. And so being able to bring these stories to the front and center is a critical piece of the conversation. And the FDA needs to know what is important to you and your loved ones. So this knowledge will be integrated into the FDA's decision-making and hopefully lead to better treatments and potentially faster approvals for therapeutics related to PSP. Why are we doing this now? There's been a few clinical trials related to PSP in the last year or so, and we anticipate more in the near future. So we're excited that this is a one-time opportunity for people with PSP and their family members to share your story of living with PSP and get these stories to the key decision makers. You can join this workshop and provide input regardless of where you live and regardless of whether you're early in your PSP journey or whether you've been navigating the journey for a few years now. Your story is really the most important part, so we hope everyone will join the workshop, and we'll also discuss other ways you can provide feedback to the workshop by written comments and by phone on the day of. So the primary goal of this workshop and effort is that we want to hear directly from people with PSP and their care partners about your perspectives on living with PSP and your experience with current treatments. And the goal is to improve the development of new drugs in the research pipeline and inform the context and conversation in which regulatory decisions will be made for new drugs with PSP. And with that, I'm delighted to pass it over to our partners at Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara that have been helping CurePSP plan this meeting. They're regulatory experts that work on these workshops for a variety of different interest areas. So we're really excited to have their expertise and guidance here. So they'll take over and provide a lot of content orienting you to what the FDA drug development process looks like, what PFDD meetings look like, and most importantly, where you can step in and provide your input in the lead up to the meeting and on the day of. So with that, I will turn it over to James Valentine and Sarah Wicks. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer. And it's such a pleasure. Sarah and I are so pleased to be here today with the PSP community and have the opportunity to share with you some information, whether you're someone that's joining because you are interested in attending this upcoming ELPFDD meeting and you want to get a little bit better understanding of what this day is all about and feel prepared, or maybe you're attending today's webinar unsure of what this meeting's all about and whether this meeting's for you. And of course, we hope by the end of this, you'll see that this is a meeting for people living with PSP and their care partners. And every single one of you have something important to contribute to this very important day. So if we go to the next slide, so Sarah and I want to give you a little bit of background to, consider, importantly, first to know, understand the overall process and audience for this meeting that we're trying to inform, the process of drug development, and the FDA is the regulator who oversees drug development and ultimately makes approval decisions for new drugs. But then importantly, give you a better understanding of where your voice fits into that process, and then specifically how this meeting will bring your voices out, and we'll give you some very specific information about what the meeting looks like and how you'll be able to participate. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to start here with that initial background on the FDA and drug development. Anytime we're trying to educate or advocate, it's important to know our audience, so that way we tailor the type of information that we share to inform that audience. And in this case, this is an audience that's very focused, whether it's the FDA themselves or drug developers, on bringing new therapies through research and development to all of you. And so I'm going to walk us through each of those steps of how products are developed, so that way you will be able to see why understanding what is important to people living with PSP and their care partners, really is key at each of these different stages. And so all of this begins with before we even have a drug that's being researched, we're doing drug discovery. And what is drug discovery? Well, this is a process through which we're first doing basic science research, the type of research maybe the NIH or academic institutions are doing to try to better understand the disease and the disease process. where in the, underlying biology of the disease can we intervene to maybe try to stop or reverse the effects of the disease? And then that allows us and gives us targets to essentially screen possible drugs to help have those effects. And so we might be looking to see if we can repurpose drugs that already exist. Many drugs, have many different targets, or different diseases have shared targets. And so we can look to see if they have those, kind of secondary or even unanticipated effects in PSP, or as science and medical technologies evolve and advance, we may be able to use those new technologies to design or develop a new drug to have a particular effect. And a lot of the times that allows us to maybe even intervene more upstream, like try to address the root cause of the disease and have a disease modifying effect. But whichever way it is, whether it's an existing drug or a new drug, once we've screened them, identified something that might be useful, then we start going down this well-established path to try to assess whether the drug works, if it's effective, and that it's safe. And so if we go to the next slide, here you'll see that the first place where we go to start testing whether that drug is safe, effective, is in the preclinical setting. Preclinical meaning before going into the clinic, which means before testing in humans. But I'll draw your attention to the bottom of the slide, and what you see here is a figure that describes all of the different stages we're going to be talking about that advance from left to right through drug development. And one thing that I want to call out as we dive into this is that what I'm going to be talking about is the typical progression through product development. But in a rare disease like PSP, there are often ways to expedite products through development. And one of those ways can be through consolidating different phases of development, for example, phases 1 and 2, which we'll be talking about. And also, maybe requiring, studies of different sizes or scopes that might be needed for a more prevalent or common condition. So just wanted to call that out as we're diving into this. But getting back to preclinical development, again, this is before we're testing in humans. We want to know at this stage, is the drug reasonably safe for use in humans? We do what are called toxicology studies to assess that. And at the same time, we also want to know whether the drug, and particularly different doses of the drug, might be effective against the disease target. And so even though we're not yet testing in people living with the disease or condition, we can use different animal and non-animal tests to try to see, if the drug, and again, different doses of the drug, have that effect. And this gives us a sense of whether we have doses that have a positive benefit risk to take into the clinic and begin our first in human clinical trials. But in order to begin and do any clinical trials, we first have to go to the FDA, take this preclinical data, and submit what's called an investigational new drug application, or IND. And this just shows is kind of very representative of how, as we progress through development, we're going to FDA, running the new data that we have by them, making our proposals to them and getting their feedback. So if we go to the next slide, typically at this stage, we're going into phase 1 of clinical development. So in that IND submission, we have those pharmacology and toxicology studies. Those are the studies of, we were just talking about pharmacology of how the drug works, toxicology of the drug safety. Importantly, there's a third prong, to the types of information FDA looks at, which is about drug quality, and that's the manufacturing information. At every stage of development, we want to ensure that when a person is receiving a drug, that they're receiving the right amount of the active ingredient. We don't want to overdose or underdose a person. We also want to ensure that there's not harmful impurities that the manufacturing process might lead to being included in the product. And so FDA is looking at that quality information as well. And then the third prong of the IND that FDA is looking at is, what is the study plan? What is the drug developer proposing, and that's in the form of a clinical trial protocol and other investigator information. And so FDA, they review this. This review's pretty quick. It's 30 days to get, review all this information and then determine whether it's, the data supports going into that first in human clinical trial. And typically these first in human clinical trials as phase 1 studies are very short, very small studies. Very typically with a drug that's never been used in people before, we'll start with single doses of the drug just to see what the safety profile looks like. And then we start going, and then we start with the lowest dose and little by little work our way up to higher doses. And then we do the same thing with a small number of doses. So we have the multiple ascending dose portion of this, and similarly start low and work our way up. Here, safety is key. Sometimes because all we're really focused on in safety is these studies, phase 1 studies are done in what are called healthy volunteers, people without a particular disease or condition. But in rare diseases, phase 1 can frequently be done in individuals living with the disease or condition as well. So that way we can, again, try to expedite development, start to gather some information on how the product actually works in those people. Even though we are focused primarily on safety, we do get to start now for the first time in people, seeing where the drug gets to in the body, how long it stays there, how long it takes to be excreted from the body. And that gives us some confidence about what doses, will, have activity in, trying to treat the disease. So once we have this information, if we go to the next slide, we can, take that information. Hopefully, we will be narrowing it down to a set of doses that we want to then take into phase 2. Phase 2 is what I call the proof of concept, portion of product development. So we're starting to shift away from primarily just looking at safety to now starting to get an understanding of how the drug works and its effectiveness. Because of this, phase 2 studies are always done with people who have a particular disease or condition, not healthy volunteers. And once we start looking at effectiveness, we, also often introduce a control group, most typically a placebo control group, placebo being what is thought of as like the sugar pill, something that allows us to know whether what is being experienced in the trial is because of the drug itself or because you're in a trial. A lot of times you get, very attentive care from being in a clinical trial. And that placebo effect. And so we want to be able to discern drug effect from placebo effect. Of course, safety is still very important as we advance to every stage in development. Our studies are getting larger and longer. It allows us to start seeing different side effect profiles. And ultimately here, after phase 2, we want to, see which dose or doses of the drug have the effect that we're hoping to have. It's short-term effect typically, but again, to help us then narrow down and take 1 or 2 doses into phase 3. So if we go to the next slide, as we move then into the third and final phase of clinical development, these phase 3 studies are sometimes you'll hear them referred to as pivotal trials or registration trials. These are the studies that are intended to demonstrate drug effect. And so these are the most rigorously designed trials. So they're typically larger, randomized, double-blind, often placebo-controlled trials. Because these are larger studies and for a chronic condition like PSP would be longer, most kind of long-term chronic disease drugs are tested for at least 12 months to not only see what the initial drug effect is, but whether there's any duration of effect. And in fact, oftentimes, individuals in those studies are followed even longer, just not in a placebo-controlled fashion. And so we see what's the duration of effect. These are larger studies, so we can, because of that, start to discern if there's any effects in different populations, whether that's different ages, different baseline severities. We can slice and dice the data a little bit more, to see is the benefit risk profile look any different in different groups. And here, we want to determine which dose, kind of has definitive effectiveness and a reasonable safety profile relative to that drug benefit. And we'll be talking about how FDA weighs those things in a little bit. But these phase 3 trials, and I keep saying trials because it is typical of FDA to require at least 2 of these phase 3 trials to support a drug approval. The good news for a rare disease like PSP is much of the time in rare diseases, FDA has authorities where they're allowed to approve drugs based off of a single clinical trial. And so, the majority of rare disease drugs are approved with a single phase 3. Again, safety is always continues to be important because this is some of the longest term data that we have. We can really see how the safety profile evolves over time, if it changes at all. And in phase 3, we have a somewhat more real world population. So we can also begin to get a better sense of, other, products that people are taking, how that, interacts and what that looks like. So once we've done this assessment, if we go to our next slide, we've now, done years worth of testing, starting in animals, moving into the clinic, very small studies into, bigger and bigger studies. So what do we do with all of this? How do we get a drug approved? Well, we need to submit a marketing application to FDA. For small molecule drugs, that's called an NDA, or new drug application. For a biological product, which would be something like an enzyme, a protein, a cell therapy, a gene therapy, those are biological products. And so those are submitted under a different type of application, a BLA, or a biologics license application. They're essentially the same thing. It's just they come from different parts of the law, so they have their own names. And so before that application actually gets submitted to FDA, it's important that drug developers meet with FDA and have a pre-NDA or pre-BLA meeting where they now come in and say, we've finished our pivotal study or studies, and this is what, this is the data at a kind of high level. They're not giving them all of the data at this point, but they're showing them the top line results and saying, we think, this is sufficient, to support your review of this data. And that might then possibly lead to an approval. As part of this, we're discussing how is the data assessed? What were the analyses that were done? And the goal is to hear from FDA whether there are any major or unresolved issues. And that can sometimes lead to needing to do more work, maybe even additional clinical trials. But assuming that there aren't those major issues, then the drug developer can come in, submit that NDA or BLA, and it includes everything, not just the phase 3 data. It includes all of the preclinical phase 1, 2, and 3 data together. So it's a huge amount of information that's being compiled, synthesized, summarized, and submitted to the FDA for their review. If we go to our next slide, that then takes us into the FDA review. FDA, gets this huge amount of information. They first make sure they have all the different types of information that they are supposed to have to be able to approve a drug. If they deem the application as being complete, they file the application, assign a review team, and then they start reviewing those same things that we were talking about really early on, at the IND phase, which is what's the drug's effectiveness? What's the safety profile of the drug? No drug is perfectly safe. So it's what are the safety risks, and then ultimately whether the benefits of the drug outweigh the risks. So given that every drug has some risks, it's a balancing act. Do the benefits actually, on balance, outweigh risks? And this is a really important part of this presentation, is for you all to know that while FDA, they're the experts in doing the data analysis. They can look at the data and say, here's what the benefits are. Here's what the risks are. What they don't inherently have the ability to do is say, and in this particular population, people living with this condition, these benefits should get this much weight, and these risks should get this much weight. That is a subjective determination. And so this type of meeting and your voices help calibrate that. There's no formula for FDA. And so they need to know what's important to you all. So they know how much weight to give to certain benefits. They know how to consider how much risk tolerance you all have. So that way they can make that determination. Um, as I mentioned before, quality and for the manufacturing of the product is also important, especially at this stage. We're scaling up manufacturing to get the drug to as many people as might be prescribed it, if it's approved. And so that information is looked at as well. I do want to note that there can be an opportunity for the community's voice to be heard as part of this process if FDA convenes an advisory committee. These are meetings of external experts that FDA convenes to bring difficult questions to them for their input. And as part of that, there's what's called an open public hearing that allows the community to have a voice during the process. And so those are things to keep an eye out for. But if we go to the next slide here, so assuming then at the end of this, FDA determines the benefits outweigh the risks, drugs approved, the job of the drug developer and FDA don't stop there. Knowledge continues to be accumulated as the drug is then used in the real world, particularly with regard to new safety information as it's going out to a much greater number of people. Sometimes there's very rare themselves safety events that can happen. And so FDA's job is to make sure that the benefits continue to outweigh the risks as the drug is on the market. Go to the next slide. So we've talked a lot about how we get drugs, once they're identified all the way through development and approved. Let's talk a little bit about FDA because this meeting is geared for FDA to hear from this community. So I want to just share a little bit more specifically about FDA's role, what it is, what it isn't. So go to the next slide. So within that drug development process and those clinical trials, it's important for you to know that FDA is not the one actually developing drugs. That's researchers, drug companies, in some cases, even not-for-profit groups. A drug just yesterday was approved that was developed by a not-for-profit. And so, but at the end of the day, it's not FDA, which means FDA is also not the one running clinical trials. They're not on site when clinical trials are being run. It's the researchers who are conducting trials and then ultimately needing to seek FDA's input and approval before they start any trial. So if we go to the next slide, I also want to mention where FDA fits in and where they don't fit in once a drug is available and approved. So FDA, they regulate, the drug companies. They're not regulating your doctors as they practice medicine. And so what does that mean? FDA is regulating development. We've talked a little bit about that. They're also regulating the marketing of medical products. So whether that's what a company can say to doctors who might prescribe the drug, what a drug company can say in an advertisement, like the TV ads that we see where there's a really long list of all of the side effects, that's what FDA is overseeing. Doctors, on the other hand, can, in their scope of their practice of medicine, use FDA-approved drugs for things that are not necessarily approved by FDA, and that's called an off-label use. And so FDA, they're not overseeing doctors or the healthcare system. They're really focused on the medical products themselves. And kind of similarly, FDA is not regulating the price of medicine or whether insurance companies offer access or cover medicines. They actually can't even consider that, even if they had the information. They're not making a cost benefit determination. They're really making a benefit risk determination. So if we go to the next slide, I've mentioned now a lot of things that FDA doesn't do. So let me just say something about what they actually do. So FDA, they do as part of their mission, not only have a part of the mission to protect the public health, but to help promote the public health. And they do take that seriously and help, as part of that, facilitate drug development. On that little figure I had with all the different steps of drug development, I could have had little arrows pointing all along the way for all the different meetings that happen between the researchers and drug developers and FDA, where they're coming to FDA. They're getting FDA's technical assistance in designing trials, in interpreting data from studies. FDA, they see every product that's being developed, a lot of information that's not public. And so they have a lot of expertise and learnings that they can share. And so, we all benefit, from those interactions. throughout product development. That's primarily done through those meetings, but also other types of written feedback as well. And so FDA, when they approach this PFDD meeting, are not only looking to inform the end, that benefit risk decision, but really to help even inform early on, are we going to be measuring the right things in clinical trials that are important to people living with the condition? And are we making those kind of gating decisions of, can we advance from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, based off of the benefit risk in this particular, population. Again, using your input to calibrate that decision. So if we go to the next slide here, we covered a lot of information. This might have been a refresher for some of you. This might have been new information to others. But if you want to get more information about FDA and how they regulate medical products, or if you just want to see generally, some more information for, people living with a condition, how you can be involved with FDA, they have a great website, fda.gov/patients. Feel free to check that out, and do even a little bit of a deeper dive. But at this stage, if we go to our next slide, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Wicks, who is going to now talk about where your voice fits into that process.
Thanks so much, James, for that great overview on drug development, which provided really the foundation for why we're doing this meeting. And as mentioned earlier, and as you've heard many times during this webinar, what we are preparing for is an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, or ELPFDD meeting, specifically for PSP. Next slide. And so what really is the purpose of this meeting? You heard James talk about all the different steps that FDA takes to review data and clinical studies for the development of new drugs. Well, some time ago, the FDA actually realized that there was an important voice that was missing from their process, and that was the voice of people actually living with the condition and their caregivers. So the FDA developed a more systematic way to gather the perspectives of people living with a condition and their caregivers about that particular condition. And this is really important even for rare diseases such as PSP, where the FDA might not necessarily know that much about the condition in the first place. And so this kind of information really helps inform the FDA's understanding of these diseases, so that when they're evaluating the potential benefits and risks of a new drug for a particular disease, it helps them in having the necessary background information and information on the lived experience with that condition to help make regulatory decisions. For example, this helps FDA during drug development, such as when they are helping drug developers think through clinical trial designs and endpoints that should be evaluated in those clinical studies, as well as at the end of the drug development process, when drug developers submit all of that data that James was describing to the FDA in a marketing application. The FDA will use the patient experience to help them in their reviews and decision making about whether or not to approve the drug. Next slide. So I mentioned something called a benefit risk assessment, and this is a formal assessment that's done by the FDA for every drug that they are reviewing. And the purpose of it is to really decide, as it sounds, whether the benefits of the new treatment outweigh the potential risks or side effects of the treatment. And so in order to understand this, the FDA needs to analyze what the disease or condition is and what current treatments are available to people living with that condition. For example, are there other FDA-approved treatments available? Or are people just simply treating the symptoms of the disease because there are no FDA-approved treatments for the condition? And also, how effective are those currently available treatments? And so this helps FDA to understand really the landscape of living with this condition, including what the unmet medical need is for the community. And then as far as the benefits of the treatment and the potential risk, as I mentioned, this is the data that comes from clinical trial experience. And so when a company submits all of their data to the FDA evaluates, what did those clinical studies show and what were the potential side effects of this new treatment? And so the first two things, the analysis of the condition and the current treatment options, that's where this ELPFDD meeting on PSP is really going to benefit and help the FDA when they go to conduct these types of benefit risks assessments for future treatments for PSP. Next slide, please. And so the meeting, as I mentioned, that we're currently planning for is specific for the PSP community. And we've been doing that with the support of the FDA to really ensure that the topics and questions that we cover during the meeting come from FDA's benefit risk framework, which, as I mentioned, represents important considerations in their decision-making process. And as a result of those considerations, we've tailored the meeting agenda and panel and discussion questions for the meeting to really try to communicate what the most important information related to PSP is. And of course, FDA has emphasized to us that active patient involvement and participation is really the key to the success of this meeting. And so that's why we are having this webinar for you today to try and get you excited about the meeting if you're not quite sure to participate yet, or if you have decided to participate, to let you know how you can do so leading up to the meeting and on the day of the meeting. Next slide, please. And so one question that we always get is, what happens after this meeting? And so at the end of the day, everything that is shared by people living with PSP and their care partners is going to be summarized and included in a voice of the patient report. And this is a summary of all testimony provided by people living with PSP and their care partners. It includes all of the responses to the polling questions that we are going to do on the meeting day, as well as any written comments or comments that are shared by calling in. And so this document really becomes a key communication for FDA review staff, as well as drug developers, and really anyone who is interested in PSP. It is going to be a publicly available document that is going to share and describe what is most important in a treatment to people living with PSP and their caregivers. And so FDA really wants this information so that it gives them information about ways to meaningfully develop and think about treatments for PSP. Next slide. And now we'll just give a little bit more information on how you can actually participate in the upcoming meeting. Next slide, please. So who is this meeting for? Obviously, it is for people living with PSP and their caregivers. It is for FDA staff. It is for pharmaceutical and biotech companies that are developing products and future treatments for PSP. And it's really for anyone interested in PSP. It is a public meeting, so anyone is open and invited to attend. However, the crux of the meeting participation, as far as who will be actively sharing their experience, we really just want to hear from people living with PSP and their care partners, because it is their lived experience that is going to be shared with FDA. So no other participants will be sharing information on the day of the meeting. The meeting will take place on Friday, February 6th, early next year, from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and the meeting will be virtual. So you can attend from anywhere in the world through an interactive live stream that is going to be made available on the PSP meeting webpage, which is at this link on the website on this slide. And so, even though we've talked a lot about the United States FDA and the FDA drug development process, this meeting isn't just limited to folks in the United States. The beauty of this virtual meeting is that people living with PSP and their care partners and anyone else interested in attending, no matter where you are in the world, can attend and join us on February 6th. And if you can just join us for an hour, that is great. If you can join us for the full day, that's even better. And if you can't join us on the 6th, or you can't join us for the full time, there are still ways for you to share your experiences, which I'll talk about in a few moments. Next slide, please. So just to give a quick overview of what to expect on the day of the meeting, there will be a welcome and introductory comments from CurePSP as well as FDA. And then the rest of the day is actually divided into two topics. In the morning, we're going to focus on how PSP symptoms affect you or your loved one's life. And in the afternoon, we are going to focus on current treatment approaches and clinical trial experience. And so to kick off the morning session, we'll start with a quick presentation by a PSP expert to provide a clinical overview of PSP. And then this will be followed by an interactive discussion, starting with pre-recorded statements by people living with PSP and their care partners. And following that, there will then be polling questions and a moderated discussion with the audience, which is you, where you will be answering questions like what symptoms do you or your loved one have, and which ones affect you or your loved one the most. We will then take a lunch break for a half hour. And when we come back, we're going to shift gears, as I mentioned, to talk about treatment approaches. And so this will similarly start with an overview on the treatment landscape by a PSP expert. There will be a panel of pre-recorded statements provided by people living with PSP and their care partners, as well as polling and moderated audience discussion, where some of the questions you could expect are, what are your current treatment approaches? And if there was going to be a new treatment for PSP, what would you like to see? There will then be a summary and brief closing remarks. Next slide, please. And so I gave you a little preview just now of some of the discussion questions to expect, but I wanted to give a little bit more detail here. And so for the morning topic, which is your experience living with PSP, some other questions you could expect are, of all the symptoms of PSP, which 1 to 3 symptoms have the most significant impact on your loved one's life? How does PSP affect you or your loved one on best and worst days? And then please describe those best and worst days. And then, are there specific activities that are important to you that you or your loved one can't do at all or as fully as you would like because of living with PSP? Next slide. Other questions that might be asked are, how have you or your loved one's symptoms changed over time? And how has the ability to cope with those symptoms changed over time? You know, when we talk about symptoms, we want to know not only about the physical symptoms, but also psychological and emotional symptoms. And then, what do you fear the most as you or your loved one gets older? What do you worry about as with respect to how the condition might change and what frustrates you the most about having this condition, especially over the long term. Next slide. And as I said in the afternoon, we are going to shift gears to talk about treatments for PSP. And so some of the discussion questions for this discussion topic are going to be things like, what are you or your loved one currently doing to manage PSP symptoms? And this not only includes medications that they are taking, whether approved or unapproved, on or off label, but also things like lifestyle modifications. Not just, this isn't just limited to pharmacological treatments, lifestyle modifications, other physical or occupational therapy, for example, or even homeopathic treatments as well. And so, how well do these treatments treat the most significant symptoms of PSP? And then conversely, we also want to hear about the downsides of what you're currently doing to manage PSP. So, what are those the most significant side effects to those current treatments, and how do they affect you or your loved one's daily life? We want to hear about this because sometimes, even when there's a treatment available, it doesn't mean that it's really helping in a big way, or maybe there's a downside. It's really burdensome to take, or the side effects are just awful. And so, something else that we would like to hear about are short of a complete cure. What specific things would you be looking for in an ideal treatment for PSP? Next slide. And so, to give you an idea of the ways that we will be discussing these topics on the day of the meeting. As I mentioned, there will be a panel of people living with PSP and their caregivers for each topic in the morning and in the afternoon. These pre-recorded statements that I had mentioned earlier. And the purpose of these recordings is to really set the foundation for the broader audience discussion. And these panelists have been selected to reflect the broadest range of experience with PSP. And so the live audience is going to have a chance to answer polling questions, which is to really provide a starting point for the discussion. It gives us a chance to learn a little bit more about who we have in the audience joining us on the day of the meeting. And you can do these polling questions right on your phone or tablet or computer during the meeting itself. And then, as I mentioned, there's going to be moderated discussions with the audience as well. And the purpose of this is to really build on what we heard from the pre-recorded panelist statements. And so the moderator, who's actually James, who you heard from earlier today, he is going to be asking questions and inviting you from the audience to submit responses, either in writing or preferably to call in and call in and chat with him live during the meeting. Next slide, please. And so tips for effective participation on the day of the meeting. First and foremost, please join us on the day of the meeting and participate in as many ways as you feel comfortable. We highly encourage you to participate in the live polling, to call in when James says to pick up the phone, and to submit written comments, and those will be sent in via email. More information you'll get on the day of the meeting for that email address. But then also keep in the back of your mind what James had said about FDA's role and the purpose of the meeting. We're not going to want to talk about insurance or high drug costs, because FDA doesn't regulate any of those things. We really want to keep the discussion limited to the two topics that I described earlier. And we would suggest reviewing some of those discussion questions in advance. And those discussion questions, which you will have access to from the recording of this webinar, but they will also be posted on the CurePSP website as well. So you'll be able to review those in advance and think about things that you would want to share. And so you can pick up your phone and call in on the day of the meeting to share your experience based on the topic that we're discussing at that particular moment in time. And just know that it is more than okay to reiterate a feeling or an experience that someone else has already voiced, because if something is said multiple times during the meeting, that's a signal to FDA that that must be something really important to the community. Just remember to share that just based on your unique perspective and to give it your own personal touch. But we do want to hear from as many voices as possible. So we just ask that you keep your comments as concise and focused as possible. And as I mentioned, if you can't join us on the day of the meeting, or if you think of things to share after the meeting, you can always submit written comments even after the meeting is over, and all of those comments and feedback will be incorporated into the voice of the patient report. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned, you'll be able to participate in the meeting through the live broadcast, through the polling questions, calling in to provide comments, as well as submitting written comments via email. You can RSVP and register for the meeting right now at the website on the slide. And I mentioned that even leading up to the meeting, you'll be able to submit written comments to answer those discussion questions. And so that form will be available on the same website where you can register. It's not yet active, but it will be in a week or so. So continue to check back to the website for updates. And if you register for the meeting, you should get an email update letting you know when the form is available. And as I mentioned, all feedback, no matter how you provide it, whether you call in, submit written comments the day of the meeting, or submit written comments before or after the meeting, all of that will be in the voice of the patient report. Next slide, please. So in summary, this is your community's opportunity to be a part of the drug development process and to move drug development forward. Please know that each and every one of you has a meaningful impact on clinical trial design and drug development from the very beginning of the process. Should try and help companies design trials that better meet your needs, as well as to help FDA assess the risks and benefits of future treatments. You can provide an impact. So I hope you can join us on the day of the meeting or share your experiences in writing and help us get the word out to help make a difference for your community. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jennifer for the last 5 minutes for question and answers.
Thank you both so much for the great information. We have a few minutes to tackle a few questions. So if you have any additional questions about the workshop or the content we just went through, feel free to put them into the chat box. There were a few that came in. And so James, I might ask you to speak to, there was one question about whether this workshop is specific to PSP or whether people can share experience with other disease areas. Are you able to answer that question for the group?
Well, if you want to get started on that, Jennifer, I was teeing up a couple other questions.
Sure.
But yeah, why don't you start?
Well, I can address the CBS CBD question. This workshop will be specific to PSP at this time, so it's just for people with likely diagnosis of PSP. CurePSP works on 3 disease areas, so we're always keeping an eye out for opportunities to speak on behalf of our communities and get community members involved. So we have a lot of ongoing advocacy efforts that are open to all 3 disease areas. You can check out the CurePSP website for that information, and we're looking into other opportunities similar to this for other disease areas. So if we are able to make those happen, they will be advertised in a similar manner. So we're looking forward to that possibility.
And that's what I wanted to add on is to just know, for those of you who represent that part of the community, that FDA likes to work with patient organizations over time, and I know Sarah and I have worked with organizations over time where we've come back and had whether it's additional PFDD meetings, there's other opportunities to have the patient voice heard through other mechanisms. So it's for CurePSP, it's not one and done with this meeting. So one question I saw that it was really a couple of different comments and questions on this point was really around diagnosis and better diagnosis, and how does that kind of fit into what FDA's purview in this meeting. And so what I'll say is first off, FDA, in addition to regulating drug products, so treatments and preventative drugs, they do have the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH, that regulates diagnostic products. And so that is within FDA's purview. That part of FDA is not the part of FDA that runs these meetings, although this information is shared with them. What I'll say in terms of this, really the scope of the meeting is, kind of the difficulty of getting a diagnosis is not really the focus. It is important as part of telling your story for us to know, maybe what you were experiencing or your loved one was experiencing prior to diagnosis, and then once a diagnosis was received. Similarly, with treatments, you might not have been receiving the same treatments or standard of care until you got a diagnosis. So kind of talking about that and that length of time it took to get the right diagnosis can be really important. But I wouldn't emphasize or focus too much on it took us, going to 10 different healthcare centers and, all of these years, kind of really the burden of getting a diagnosis would not really be the focus for this meeting. Another question I saw, there was a number of people speaking about different aspects of clinical trials. I saw one person talk about wanting to be in a clinical trial, but not meeting eligibility criteria. Saw a couple of comments about experiences from people who participated in clinical trials. And, I want you all to know that clinical trials, especially in a rare disease like PSP, are considered part of that treatment, umbrella of what we're trying to capture. Sarah went over some of the questions that we want you to answer about treatments. And so you can also answer those questions with regard to clinical trials. So for those of you who might be interested in participating in a trial, but either haven't yet or have been ineligible to, you can share those experiences and frustrations. And then for those of you who have been in trials, and whatever your experience has been, good or bad, know that you can share those experiences. And I saw some comments about, I had this many points on this scale, kind of is what my experience was in the trial. Know that, while that is helpful to hear, actually then hearing what that actually meant in your loved one's life is really kind of helping connect the dots and the type of thing we'd hope that you'd be able to share, in addition to just, giving us a numeric readout of kind of what changed on some clinical outcome scale. Uh, Another good question, just working through you, the very active chat, love to see it, is around more advanced patients and how do their voices fit in. And there was a specific question about, can people submit videos? So in terms of the meeting format, um, for someone who may not, be able themselves to, for example, call in and speak for themselves, we would encourage their care partner to do so. We will not just be relying on kind of the clinical experts to share that part of the story. Very much we want to hear from those families and help share their story. Certainly, that also can be submitted, in writing in advance or after the meeting. But this is not just a meeting for people living with PSP, but also very much spouses, children, other family members, other direct caregivers. We want to hear from you, and you may be best situated to help share that experience with the audience. And Sarah mentioned that we do have some pre-recorded panel statements, and so those panels are intended to reflect a broad range of perspectives, and that will have a little bit more of a visual component to it as well. But for all of you that will be in the live audience, regardless of where you or your loved one fit into kind of the journey with PSP, we want to hear your voices. Jennifer, anything you want to add, on that question about more advanced patients?
No, I mean, I think you covered it. I think it'll be really important to have a really broad um, range of perspectives covered. So, I mean, the most important thing is sharing your own experience. So I think anyone who can come and share what you've been through, regardless of stage of disease journey, it will be incredibly valuable for the workshop.
Just
And with that, I
quickly.
think, are there any other questions you want to address, James?
I think that is everything kind of that seems related for this meeting. But of course, if you have any other questions or if you feel like something wasn't answered, please send us an email. Jennifer can, we're part of the team, so anything that we can help answer, we'll collectively make sure we get back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So a big thanks to James and Sarah for the content, and a big thanks to all of you for logging on to today's call. We hope that you'll contribute to the workshop, either by written comments ahead of time and also by joining us live on the day of. Like we've said throughout the meeting, everyone's welcome. The meeting will be very centered around progressive supranuclear palsy, but regardless of where you live, your your stage of PSP journey, we hope that there's a way for you to contribute, whether it's by written comments or engaging with the polling or calling in. It will all be really, really helpful to share and compile with the FDA, and just a great way to make sure your voices are heard as part of the process. Meeting registration is open. I put the link in the chat, and there's a form there for you to register, and we'll be in touch with people in the coming months with more details on how you can engage with the workshop. So thank you all for joining here today. Thank you to James and Sarah. The recording will be available on the website. Please reach out if you have any other questions.